You know, I'm hearing this, and I want to hear this. Let me spell it out for you, Sir John. You've only gotten exactly what you deserve. First, you ripped off that old woman, Mistress Quickly, by eating her out of house and home and not paying any of the money you owe her. You said that she's the meanest old woman that you've ever seen. Well, now she wants you out of her tavern, so you'll have to pack your things and go. That's right. When will you learn that you don't treat people this way? And don't bother trying to con her again by saying you'll be back on your feet someday because, and these are her words, not mine, she don't care if you do, 'cause it's understood. You ain't got no money and you just ain't no good. It's time for you to face the facts, Falstaff. When you challenged Hal, your former drinking buddy, to banish Plump Jack and banish all the world, he said, I do. I will. Well, guess what? He did. And Hal is now officially Henry V, King of England. And no matter what you say, you heard him tell you at his coronation, I know thee not, old man. So whether you still don't understand or you just think he can't mean that, hear me and hear me, good Falstaff. The king hath banished thee. Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back until you've changed your ways, and that means no more bribes, no more debts, no more lies, no more thefts. Yeah, hit the road, Jack. And don't you come back no more. In 2002, Arizona Cardinals football player Pat Tillman walked away from a $3.6 million NFL contract to enlist in the U.S. Army and fight in the War on Terror after the attacks of 9/11. He died a hero in 2004 after being killed by friendly fire. Pat Tillman not only demonstrated true integrity, but personified maturity and sacrifice, two of the themes we'll be exploring today in Henry IV Part 2. We first see Northumberland, who is being told that his son Hotspur is alive and has been victorious, but that turns out to just be a false rumor. Next, we see that Falstaff continues to drink and engage in petty criminal activity in the London underworld. He first appears, followed by a young page, whom Prince Hal has assigned to him as a joke. Falstaff inquires of the page what the doctor has said about the analysis of his urine, and the page comically tells him that the urine is healthier than the patient. Falstaff continues to brag, saying, I am not only witty in myself, but the cause that wit is in other men. Falstaff vows to dress his page in vile apparel, in other words, ragged clothing. He then complains of his insolvency, calling it a consumption of the purse. As the two of them walk, Falstaff vows to marry a wife in the stews. That would be in the local brothels. The Lord Chief Justice is looking for Falstaff, but when he finds him, Falstaff at first pretends that he's deaf so he can avoid talking with him. However, when his plan fails, Falstaff pretends to mistake the Lord Chief Justice for someone else. As the Chief Justice tries to question Falstaff about a recent robbery at Gad's Hill, Falstaff changes the subject to discuss the illness afflicting King Henry IV. Falstaff then adopts the pretense that he is a much younger man than the Chief Justice, saying, You that are old consider not the capacities of us that are young. Finally, he asks the Chief Justice for £1,000 to help him outfit his military efforts, but is denied. Falstaff has a relationship with a prostitute named Doll Tearsheet, who gets into a fight with Falstaff's ensign, the ancient Pistol. After Falstaff chases off Pistol, Doll asks Falstaff about Prince Hal, and Falstaff is embarrassed when his offensive remarks are overheard by the prince who is nearby with coins, and both of them are disguised as musicians. Falstaff tries to talk his way out of it, but Hal is not taken in by this. When news comes of a second rebellion, Falstaff rejoins the army and goes to the country in order to raise military forces. While there, Falstaff meets an old school friend named Justice Robert Shallow, and they reminisce about the lusty and bawdy follies of their youth. Shallow produces several potential recruits to join the Loyalist army, including Mouldy, Bullcalf, Feeble, Shadow, and Wart. They are, to say the least, a motley collection of rustic yokels. Falstaff and his cronies take bribes from Mouldy and Bullcalf to avoid being enlisted. Meanwhile, Hal remains in the company of London's riffraff and still seems unsuited to be king. His father, King Henry IV, is once again disappointed in Hal because of his casual exploits, despite reassurances from his court. Another rebellion is launched against Henry IV, but this time it is defeated, not by a battle, but by the underhanded strategic scheming of Hal's brother, Prince John. King Henry then sickens and appears to die. When Hal enters his father's chamber and thinks his father is dead, Hal believes he's the king and exits the chamber with the crown. Meanwhile, King Henry awakens and is devastated, thinking that Hal cares only about becoming king. But Hal convinces him otherwise, and Henry dies contentedly and reconciled with his son. The Chief Lord Justice, who was Hal's strict tutor when he was a boy, fears retribution now that Hal is the king. But the Chief Justice pleads his case that he acted out of his obligation to raise Hal properly and responsibly, and Hal agrees, asking the Lord Chief Justice to be his mentor and just as strict a tutor to Hal's own son when he has one. In the final scene, Falstaff learns from Pistol that Henry IV is dead and Hal is now the king. Falstaff, along with his associates, go to London, fully expecting that he will be greatly welcomed and rewarded. But Hal rejects him outright, saying that now that he is the king, he can no longer associate with such riffraff. Hal, now crowned Henry V, turns his back on Falstaff and instructs the Lord Chief Justice to have Falstaff removed. Falstaff and his cronies, who expected to enjoy free reign as pickpockets under Hal's governance, are instead banished and imprisoned by the authorities. When we get back, we'll look at some of the remarkable characters in Henry IV Part 2. All right, now let's take a look at some of the characters. First, we have Henry IV, who is Henry Bolingbroke, who we first saw in Richard II when he usurped that king, his cousin, to become the King of England. And although he's a better king than Richard, he's still putting down rebellions because of how he came to the throne. Next, we have Hal, also known as Prince Harry, also known as the Prince of Wales. He is Henry IV's oldest son and heir to the throne. Hal spent his youth among riffraff and reprobates, much to his father's chagrin, but the time is coming for him to become king. Scrope is the Archbishop of York, who, along with Sir Thomas Mowbray and Lord Hastings, lead the rebel forces against Henry IV and are taken in by Prince John, prematurely disband their troops, and are arrested and executed for treason. Talk about having a bad day. We also have the return of one of Shakespeare's greatest creations, the Fat Knight, also known as Sir John Falstaff. Falstaff is the same pickpocket, rogue, drunkard, mooch, and liar from Part 1, who, along with his cronies Bardolph, Peto, and Ned Poins, hang out in bars with Hal. There is also a new character introduced as Falstaff's ancient, or ensign, named Pistol, who is always flying into a fury and must be continually restrained. By the way, the Elizabethan pistol was just coming into fashion at the end of the 1500s. They were reportedly very inaccurate and in some cases prone to go off unexpectedly. Shakespeare certainly took advantage of these qualities when he created Pistol, who frequently is told not to go off or discharge wherever he is. Mistress Quickly also returns as the hostess of the Boar's Head Tavern where Falstaff resides. She has a habit of making off-color remarks that are obvious to everyone else, but are oblivious to her. Mistress Quickly introduces us to Doll Tearsheet, a whore whom she invites to cavort with Falstaff, which is odd since In just the scene before, Mistress Quickly also presses Falstaff to pay her the money he owes her and claims that he's made many promises to marry her. And finally, we meet the elderly country justice Robert Shallow, who is introduced as a familiar of Falstaff's, who recalls and brags about their younger school days when they partook in numerous instances of debauchery. Coming up, we'll look at some of the plot devices and memorable scenes from Henry IV, Part 2. Anyone familiar with Shakespeare's plays will recognize some of the plot devices he used in Henry IV, Part 2. For example, he uses the dead trick. This is when one character mistakenly believes that another character is dead when in fact the character is actually alive. It's used in several other plays. However, the scene where Henry IV falls asleep in his bed and his son Hal believes he's dead most closely resembles Romeo looking over Juliet's body in the Capulet monument and presuming that she's dead when she's only asleep. In both cases, the mistake is because someone is sleeping and not trying to fool the other person who misinterprets the situation. But unlike Juliet, Henry IV wakes up and Shakespeare uses this opportunity for him to scold Hal for wearing the crown prematurely, for Hal to correct his father and sincerely convince him that he is not power hungry, and for Henry to forgive his son and reconcile with him. There's also some interesting parallels going on in this play. One has to do with death and sickness. We see Henry IV suffering from a skin disease and lying on his deathbed. We also see in Act 1, Scene 2, Falstaff being told by his page that his doctor amusingly said, Falstaff's urine is healthy, but the patient might have more diseases than the doctor even knows exists. And in Act 2, Scene 4, Daltersheet says to Falstaff, Wilt thou leave fighting and begin to patch up thine old body for heaven? In Henry IV, Part 1, we have Falstaff giving a catechism on honor. In Henry IV, Part 2, he gives a soliloquy about the importance of drinking sack, which is a sweet wine imported from Spain. And it just wouldn't be a true Shakespeare play without a good old-fashioned prophecy. In Henry IV, Part 2, and in real life, it was prophesied that Henry IV would die in Jerusalem. In his case, he thought it meant he would be fighting a crusade, but in reality, he died in a room known as the Jerusalem Chamber in the house of the Abbot of Westminster. So true to form, the Shakespearean prophecy does come true, but not in the way it was expected. And then we have the infamous parley at the Forest of Goltres. A parley is supposed to be a military conference between opposing sides so that they can communicate their intentions to one another. During the parley, it's considered to be a truce where none of the participants are in danger. But when it comes to Henry IV, Part 2, one of the scenes that will surely set it apart from all other Shakespeare plays is Act 4, Scene 1, where we see Prince John of Lancaster go directly against the code of honor and decency under the guise of a parley and give his word to his opponents and then arrest them and have them sentenced for treason. Listen to his words. He's read their grievances and says, I like them all, and do allow them well, and swear here, by the honor of my blood, my father's purposes have been mistook, and some about him have too lavishly wrested his meaning and authority. To the Archbishop, my lord, these griefs shall be with speed redressed. Upon my soul they shall. If this may please you, discharge your power unto these several counties, and we will ours, and here between the armies, let's drink together friendly and embrace, that all their eyes may bear those tokens home of our restored love and amity. Then the Archbishop says, I take your princely word for these redresses. John of Lancaster says, I give it you and will maintain my word. Thereupon they drink. But while the rebels' army disperses, the king's army doesn't budge. Westmoreland says, Good tidings, my lord Hastings, for the which I do arrest thee, traitor of high treason, and you, Lord Archbishop, And you, Lord Mowbray, of capital treason I attach you both. Mowbray says, is this proceeding just and honorable? Westmoreland says, is your assembly so? The Archbishop says, will you thus break your faith? And John of Lancaster says, I pawned thee none. I promised you redress of these same grievances whereof you did complain, which by mine honor I will perform with the most Christian care. But for you rebels, look to taste the due, meet for rebellion and such acts as yours. Most shallowly did you these arms commence, fondly brought here, and foolishly sent hence. Strike up your drums, pursue the scattered stray. God, and not we, hath safely fought today. Some guard these traitors to the block of death, treason's true bed, and yielder up of breath. Considering that parleys appear in so many of Shakespeare's plays, including The Life and Death of King John, Richard II, Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, Henry V, Henry VI, Parts 1, 2, and 3, Richard III, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Timon of Athens, and Coriolanus, it's hard to believe that anyone would trust a war combatant to keep their word after this instance took place. We must then be led to believe that no one outside of the parties involved in subsequent parleys ever learned the truth of this instance when they in turn asked for a parley. When we return, we'll look at some of the major themes running through Henry IV, Part 2. When we talk about expectations, let's first take a look at Falstaff, who upon hearing that Henry IV is dead and that Hal, or as Pistol calls him, thy tender lambkin is now king, he thinks he's hit the jackpot. He's envisioning a world where because he was Hal's friend and surrogate father, he will now be allowed to run roughshod over the entire country and have free rein to do whatever he wants. This is Act 5, Scene 3. Master Robert Shallow, choose what office thou wilt in the land, 'tis thine. Pistol, I double charge thee with dignities. I am Fortune's steward. I know the young king is sick for me. Let us take any man's horses. The laws of England are at my commandment. Blessed are they that have been my friends, and woe to my Lord Chief Justice. And finally, in Act 5, Scene 5, Falstaff's fantasy meets Henry V's reality. When Falstaff arrives and shouts out to the newly crowned king at his coronation, he's not met with love and hugs, but with condemnation. Henry replies icily, I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers. How ill white hairs become a fool and jester. I have long dreamt of such a kind of man, so surfeit-swelled, so old, and so profane. But being awaked, I do despise my dream. Make less thy body hence, and more thy grace. Leave gormandizing. Know the grave doth gape for thee thrice wider than for other men. Reply not to me with a fool-born jest. Presume not that I am the thing I was, for God doth know, so shall the world perceive that I have turned away my former self. So will I those that kept me company. When thou dost hear I am as I have been, approach me, and thou shalt be as thou wast, the tutor and the feeder of my riots. Till then, I banish thee on pain of death, as I have done the rest of my misleaders, not to come near our person by 10 mile. For competence of life, I will allow you, that lack of means enforce you not to evils. And, as we hear you do reform yourselves, we will, according to your strengths and qualities, give you advancement. While Harry's rebuke is harsh, it certainly shouldn't have been unexpected, and thus he fulfills his expectations by bearing the burden of leadership. As we've known from the beginning of Henry IV, Part 1, Hal is going to have to grow up when he becomes the king. He's promised maturity, and he knew that meant it was going to require that he give up much of his personal freedom and make many sacrifices. Here's a scene from Act 5, Scene 2, in which Hal is addressing his three younger brothers, who all seem to be very nervous about him succeeding their father. This new and gorgeous garment, Majesty, sits not so easy on me as you think. Brothers, you mix your sadness with some fear. This is the English, not the Turkish court. Not Amurath and Amurath succeeds, but Harry. Shakespeare may be referring to Murad III, Turkish Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, who in 1574 had his 5 younger brothers strangled to prevent any of them from succeeding to the throne, and his successor did the same to his 19 brothers and half-brother too. Talk about overkill. Hal wants to ease his brother's fears that he will not act like a Turk. Yet be sad, good brothers, for by my faith it very well becomes you. Sorrow so royally in you appears that I will deeply put the fashion on, and wear it in my heart. Why then be sad, but entertain no more of it, good brothers, than a joint burden laid upon us all. For me, by heaven, I bid thee be assured, I'll be your father and your brother too. Let me but bear your love, I'll bear your cares. Yet weep that Harry's dead, and so will I. But Harry lives that shall convert those tears by number into hours of happiness. There's also a great scene where the Lord Chief Justice is worried that since Hal is now the king, he'll punish him for being such a strict teacher to him when he was young. Here he is in Act 5, Scene 2, defending himself to Hal. Sweet princes, what I did in honor, led by the impartial conduct of my soul. If truth and upright innocency fail me, I'll to the king my master that is dead, and tell him who hath sent me after him. But Hal responds, You shall be as a father to my youth. My voice shall sound as you to prompt mine ear, and I will stoop and humble my intents to your well-practiced wise directions. And then Hal addresses the entire court. Our coronation done, we will ascite, as I before remembered all our state. And God consigning to my good intents, no prince nor peers shall have just cause to say, God shorten Harry's happy life one day. This is perhaps Hal's first public demonstration of maturity and sacrifice. Hal the prodigal son is no more. Long live Henry V. And when we return, we'll look at some of Shakespeare's most powerful lines in this play. Henry IV, Part 2 is notable because it gave birth to the expression, he hath eaten me out of house and home, which Mistress Quickly tells the Lord Chief Justice in Act 2, Scene 1. After listening to country justice Robert Shallow brag to his cousin Silence and Falstaff about frequenting taverns and brothels in their school days, in Act 3, Scene 2, Falstaff comes up with this eloquent reply, We have heard the chimes at midnight. By the way, Orson Welles used Chimes at Midnight for the title of his movie, combining Henry IV's Part 1 and 2 and Henry V, in which Orson Welles himself played Falstaff and Sir John Gielgud played Henry IV. In Henry IV, Part 1, Hal and Poins disguise themselves as robbers to observe how Falstaff will respond. In Henry IV, Part 2, in Act 2, Scene 4, Hal and Poins once again disguise themselves, this time as musicians, so they can eavesdrop and observe Falstaff with his whore doll tear sheet. Poins makes the poignant observation, Is it not strange that desire should so many years outlive performance? And let's finish up this section by looking at Act 3, Scene 1, in which the king laments that every low-born soul can sleep, but he has insomnia because he has to bear the worries of a sovereign. How many thousand of my poor subjects are at this hour asleep? O sleep, O gentle sleep, nature's soft nurse, how have I frighted thee, that thou no more wilt weight my eyelids down, and steep my senses in forgetfulness? Why rather, sleep, liest thou in smoky cribs upon uneasy pallets stretching thee, and hushed with buzzing night flies to thy slumber, than in the perfumed chambers of the great, under the canopies of costly state, and lulled with sound of sweetest melody? O thou dull god, why liest thou with the vile in loathsome beds, and leaving thy kingly couch a watch-case or a common alarm bell? Wilt thou upon the high and giddy mast seal up the shipboy's eyes and rock his brains in cradle of the rude imperious surge, and in the visitation of the winds, who take the ruffian billows by the top, curling their monstrous heads and hanging them with deafening clamor in the slippery clouds that with the hurly death itself awakes? Canst thou, O partial sleep, give thy repose to the wet sea-boy in an hour so rude, and in the calmest and most stillest night, with all appliances and means to boot, deny it to a king? Then, happy low, lie down. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. I remember listening to Otis Williams, the leader of the singing group The Temptations, say that his friend and founding partner Melvin Franklin once gave him a piece of jewelry depicting the head of Christ with an inscription on it that read, "Heavy is the head that wears the crown." When we return, we'll look at some of the major turning points in the play and some of the correlations to other Shakespeare plays. The major turning point in Henry IV Part 2 is the death of that king. Once Hal is crowned Henry V, we'll finally get to see how he'll govern. First, he reassures his brothers. Next, he reassures his Lord Chief Justice. And finally, we see Falstaff and his cronies get their comeuppance. We've seen transfers of the crown before in the life and death of King John, Richard II, Henry VI Part 3, Richard III, King Lear, Macbeth, and Hamlet. In both Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, there are scenes where Henry rebukes Hal for being a wastrel, only to have Hal stand up for and redeem himself in his father's eyes. In Part 1, he does this on the battlefield. In Part 2, he does this in Act 4, Scene 3, when the two of them reconcile in the Jerusalem chamber just before Henry's death. When it comes to correlations, we have Henry IV's long bout with insomnia that plagues him after having usurped his cousin Richard II to become king. Of course, Richard was murdered by Lord Exton, thinking he was performing an act that Henry would approve of. You'll recall in Macbeth, Macbeth is also troubled by the inability to sleep after he murders his uncle, King Duncan, in order to usurp him and become king. The braggart soldier Sir John Falstaff shares some qualities with Don Adriano de Armado in Love's Labour's Lost. In this play, Falstaff is assigned a page to be his witty companion who mocks him, similar to Don Armado's sidekick Moth. Pistol bears some resemblance to Hotspur in Henry IV Part 1 because he's easily provoked into a rage or an argument. However, that's where the comparison ends. While Hotspur was always willing to risk his life for the glory of battle, Pistol is all talk and proves an even bigger coward than Falstaff. In Henry IV Part 1, Hal promises that he will banish Falstaff, and in Henry IV Part 2, he keeps his word and does indeed banish him. And we'll finish off this section with one of the most touching scenes in the entire play, which takes place in Act 4, Scene 3, when the dying Henry IV, now reconciled with Hal, is giving his son some advice about what to expect when he becomes the king. Henry IV says, "God knows, my son, by what bypaths and indirect crooked ways I met this crown, and I myself know well how troublesome it sat upon my head. To thee it shall descend with better quiet, better opinion, better confirmation." And Hal replies, "You won it, wore it, kept it, gave it me. Then plain and right must my possession be, which I, with more than with a common pain, 'gainst all the world will rightfully maintain." When we return, we'll look at some interesting facts about Henry IV, Part 2. While I was doing some research for this episode, I came across some interesting facts. The real-life Henry IV suffered from many diseases and illnesses, including insomnia, epilepsy, gout, psoriasis, and perhaps even heart disease. He's believed to have died from some sort of deforming skin disorder, possibly leprosy, but not as we would know it. Henry IV married Mary de Bohun in 1381. At the time, Henry was 13 years old and Mary was about 11. Mary lived with a relative for the next 4 years and gave birth when she was 15 years old to Henry Monmouth, aka Henry V. At the end of Henry IV Part 2, an epilogue thanks the audience and promises that the story will continue in a forthcoming play with Sir John in it and will make you merry with fair Catherine of France. It also suggests that Falstaff shall die of a sweat. Well, Falstaff does not appear on stage in the subsequent play Henry V, although his death is referred to. Falstaff's character proved to be so popular that Queen Elizabeth reportedly commissioned Shakespeare to bring the character back in another play and have Falstaff get married. While there's absolutely no evidence to support this rumor, there's no question that Shakespeare's audiences loved Falstaff and wanted to see more of him. Perhaps Shakespeare did not want to pursue the character further since the actor who was playing him left the company after this play. But in an attempt to give the audience what they want, Shakespeare does have Falstaff return in The Merry Wives of Windsor. And by the way, the infamous betrayal of Archbishop Scrope, Sir Thomas Mowbray, and Lord Hastings by Prince John of Lancaster in the Forest of Gautreks at Act 4, Scene 1 was a real event. However, it didn't take place in Gautreks Forest, it took place in Shipton Moor. And Lord Hastings wasn't there. It was Scrope, Sir Thomas Mowbray, and Scrope's nephew, Sir William Plumpton. And it was not Prince John who betrayed them. It was in reality Lord Westmoreland. All right, now let's take a look at some of the actors who perform in the 1979 BBC Shakespeare version of Henry IV Part 2. Since Shakespeare chose to follow the history of English kings, in this group of 4 plays comprised of Richard II, Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, and finishing with Henry V, we'll see that the BBC company used many of the same actors to continue their roles throughout this first tetralogy. John Finch, who plays Henry Bolingbroke in Richard II in 1978, and Henry IV in Parts 1 and 2 in 1979, also played Don Pedro in Much Ado About Nothing in 1984. David Gwillim, who plays Hal in Henry IV Part 1, continues his role in Henry IV Part 2, where he becomes King Henry V. He also played the title role in Henry V in 1979. Robert Edwards, who plays Prince John of Lancaster, continues his role straight through Henry V. He also played Lucanus in the Kenneth Branagh production of Hamlet in 1996. David Neal, who plays Scrope, the Archbishop of York, in Henry IV Part 1, continues his role in Henry IV Part 2. He also played the first senator in Timon of Athens and Proculus in Antony and Cleopatra, both in 1981. Rod Beecham, who plays the Earl of Warwick, continues his role in Henry V, as does David Buck, who plays the Earl of Westmoreland, and Brian Pringle, who plays the unforgettable Pistol. Gordon Gestileau, who plays Bardolph, continues his role not only through Henry V, but also in the 1982 version of The Merry Wives of Windsor. In addition, he plays a fisherman of Pentapolis in the 1984 version of Pericles, Prince of Tyre. Anthony Quayle, who plays Falstaff in Henry IV Parts 1 and 2, was replaced by Richard Griffiths in the 1982 BBC version of The Merry Wives of Windsor. And finally, Brenda Bruce, who plays the continuing role of Mistress Quickly in Henry IV Parts 1 and 2 and Henry V, and the first witch in the 1983 BBC version of Macbeth, was also replaced as Mistress Quickly by Elizabeth Spriggs in The Merry Wives of Windsor. Stay tuned for today's trivia challenge, which is called That bears repeating. All right, today's trivia challenge is called That Bears Repeating. Name the character who repeats these phrases 3 or more times in a row and in which plays. Number 1, abawd, abawd, abawd. Number 2, justice, 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 justice. And number 3, murder, murder, murder. When we get back, I'll have the answers for you, along with some relevant lessons from Henry IV, Part 2. Okay, let's see how you did in today's trivia challenge called That Bears Repeating. You were to name the character who repeats these phrases 3 or more times in a row and in which play. Number 1, abawd, abawd, abawd. That would be Mercutio from Romeo and Juliet. Number 2, justice, 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 justice. That would be Isabel from Measure for Measure. And number 3, murder, murder, murder. That would be Macduff from Macbeth. Now, let's look at some relevant lessons from Henry IV, Part 2. First, when dealing with anything important, trust but verify. Ronald Reagan was right when the Soviets told him that they would be disarming their nuclear arsenal. He said, "We trust that you will do this, and we will verify that you do this." This is always important to do when you're negotiating or creating a contract, especially if it's with someone who you don't really know very well. Second, avoid toxic people. Obviously, Hal enjoyed his time hanging around with Falstaff and Ned Poins, but he recognized that associating with riffraff, highwaymen, and brothel frequenters is frowned upon when you become king. He learned a lot about human nature by associating with them in his 20s, but when he finally put on the crown, he knew he had to think less like Hal and more like Henry V, who would go on to lead the English troops to victory over France at the Battle of Agincourt. And third, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Yes, I know it comes from Star Trek too, but it's also true in real life, especially if you are a leader. You have to learn to put aside your personal pursuits and do what's right for the good of the people you serve. As we said before, to whom much is given, much is expected. I'm Dave Romeo, and thank you for watching this episode of Romeo on Shakespeare. Please join me next time for the Season 1 finale, when a jealous king gives into his fears and loses his wife for the next 16 years.